Next year marks the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Isabel. Do you remember that storm? In September of 2003, Isabel made landfall on the North Carolina coast and worked her way north to Virginia. This Category 5 storm had maximum sustained winds of 165 miles an hour. It caused almost $4 billion in damage and killed 51 people. I had just begun my last year of seminary when the storm came through. From our apartment in Gitter Park, Andrea and I could see trees snapping over like toothpicks. It was frightening. And if my memory serves, much of the storm came through during the overnight hours, making for a rather sleepless night, wondering just what kind of damage we'd see in the morning. And sure enough, when we ventured out in the morning, trees and power lines were down everywhere. In the ensuing days, we were without electricity for some time, 10 days or so. I remember everyone in our seminary apartment complex worrying that without electricity, our food would spoil. That seems like such a minor problem now, worrying about your refrigerator contents. But looking back, we didn't know how long the power would be out. And what's more, seminary students are not known for their wealth. We didn't want to have to repurchase our food. I remember after a few days without power, Jay, the seminary's maintenance person, brought over a small generator to our apartment building. Because of the generator's size, it would not run power for the entire building. And it wasn't really practical to run each person's refrigerator for an hour or so, one after another. So we decided the most practical thing was to use it to cook our food. Andre and I brought out our crock pot. Another neighbor brought out a little hot plate, and we connected them to the generator. We had some ground beef we wanted to share, so we put on a pot of chili. Someone else brought over some produce they had on hand, and it made a great salad. Another person had some homemade bread that was in the freezer, and after thawing it out, gosh, it tasted like fresh from the oven. Someone else had some ice cream that was, by this point, more like soft serve, but it was so good. Looking back can make you nostalgic. I realize that. But in my mind and in my heart, it felt like Christmas in September. As I was reading Psalm 30, that story of Hurricane Isabel came to mind. In the midst of a difficult situation, we were thankful that God had brought us through. New life, in the form of friends coming together to help out friends, came from the death and destruction of that awful storm. Psalm 30 tells us that even in our sorrow, in our pain, in our anger, God has the last word. And that word is that joy, peace, and wholeness will one day come. In the psalmist's testimony, we find that his faith, joy, and healing were forged from his own bitter experience of death and pain. If we were to categorize Psalm 30, we may simply call it a prayer of thanksgiving, because in just about every verse of this psalm, we hear the psalmist's overflowing gratitude for divine deliverance. And verse 12 puts it plainly. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Now, to be sure, Psalm 30 is the thanksgiving prayer of an individual person. But as we see over and over again in the Psalms, Individual prayers often give voice to communal ones. That is, one person's gratitude reminds us of and calls out our own gratitude. You're probably aware this is why I love to tell stories in my sermons. It's not so you can hear funny anecdotes about my children. No, my aim is that when I tell a story, you are able to relate to it. And when I tell my story, you consider your own similar story. In the case of Psalm 30, the thanksgiving the poet expresses is born from a rebirth, a resurrection, an incredible healing given by God. You, O Lord, have drawn me up. I cried to you for help, and you healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, and you restored my life. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. Of course, this psalm is not some Pollyanna-ish, lighthearted, everything is unicorn and rainbows kind of psalm. No, this healing, this restoration came only after a desperate experience in Sheol, in the pit. That is, the psalmist's healing came only after experiencing hell on earth. Even though God is the author and source of our healing, even though we believe that, in the midst of our pain and heartbreak, it's not so easy to see beyond the horizon to the resurrection to come. If anyone has ever told you just to keep your head up, it's not that bad, God will take care of you. Even though that's true, none of that is helpful in the moment. I love how Henry Nouwen puts it. When we are crushed like grapes, it's hard to imagine the wine that we will become. Yes, friends, Psalm 30 describes deep pain. It is a psalm of anguish, but it is also a psalm of healing. And just as we cannot skip over the pain and jump to the joy, we cannot ignore the beautiful resurrection we receive through the sustaining presence and love of God. That's why, for me, Psalm 30 feels a little like Easter in July. Because as we continue to mourn victims of violence, as we continue to experience waves of COVID, as we continue to be a nation bitterly divided, we need to be reminded that in the midst of pain, in the midst of grief, of injustice, in the midst of racism and sexism and homophobia and all manner of ugliness and disregard, we need to be reminded that God is for us. God waits with us. And God will grant us resurrection. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. I know that feels simplistic and naive, but I believe it to be true. I have to believe it. It was almost 15 years ago. My daughter Ashley was just a newborn at the time. She was coughing and having trouble taking deep breaths. If you've ever seen a congested 1-month-old, it is downright pitiful. We took her to the doctor and he diagnosed her with RSV, a respiratory virus. There in the doctor's office, he was debating whether to put Ashley in the hospital. just 1 month prior. We were celebrating her birth with phone calls, visits, presents. We even put a ribbon on the mailbox. But here we were, tears streaming down our faces as I lay my 4-week-old daughter on that cold hospital table so they could x-ray her tiny chest. I now know that RSV is a common illness, but because Ashley was just a month old, and in the midst of all that, I was scared. My baby struggled to take deep breaths and her cough grew worse. How had we gone from balloons and streamers to a counterful of medications and nighttime nebulizer treatments? In the midst of all this, Ella, then 3.5 years old, all she wanted in the world was to play with her baby sister, to help feed her, change her diapers, and brush her little bald head. But as you can imagine, we had to separate them so as not to infect Ella or make Ashley worse. And I have to tell you, I wish I had all this on video, because one afternoon, about a month after the illness first started, my wife brought Ashley home from a checkup at the doctor where they had just gotten the all clear. She carries Ashley into our family room, and Ella gets up from her dollhouse and begins to cry tears of joy. "Mama, Mama, is it time?" "Yes, honey, Ashley is all better now." "Well then," Ella said, "bring me my baby." And for the next 2 hours, Ella held Ashley close to her own chest, rocked her, sang to her, and kissed her cheek. Weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes with the morning. Do you believe that? I believe it too. Amen.